Alright, now that we've had a little bit better look at samplers, let's go back to Wikipedia and look at sampler and kind of go through it and see what we might be missing. That might be some cool things that we might want to understand. Alright, it seems we've addressed most of these issues. A sampler is an electronic musical instrument similar in some respects to a synthesizer, but instead of generating sounds, it uses recordings or samples. We've talked about that. Of sounds that are loaded or recorded into it by the user. We've spoken of that. These sounds are then played back by means of the sampler program itself or a keyboard sequencer, which we've talked about, but let's take a look at that and see if that makes more sense to any of us. A music sequencer, or simply sequencer, is a device or application software that can record, edit, or play back music by handling note and performance information in several forms, typically CV gate, MIDI, open sound control, OSC, and possibly audio and automation data for DAWs and plugins. And I do believe we basically covered that, as far as the sequencer is concerned. If you dig into sequencers, that can get kind of complex, exactly what that sequencer is doing by doing any one of the things that are stated there, or specifically those things or combinations of those things. But I do believe that we addressed most of those issues in the basic function of that. Or another triggering device to perform or compose music. Because these samples are now usually stored in digital memory, the information can be quickly accessed. A single sample may often be pitch shifted to produce musical scales and roots. That second sampler, that basic sampler we're talking about taking those notes and making the initial sound on a root note, and then giving it you can either give it a range it's played in. And some samplers you can actually just build scales and chords and things like that with the actual samplers. So we kind of address that. Things like the arpeggiator that we talked about, that would doing that. The repeater, some of those things that we talked about would be doing things like that. Often samplers offer filters we talked about, modulation via low frequency oscillators we talked about, and other synthesizer like processors that we talked about, most of those that allow the original sound to be modified in many different ways. Most samplers have polyphonic capabilities, or monophonic we talked about. They are able to play more than one note at a time. We talked about that. Many are also multi-timbral, and they can play different sounds simultaneously. We talked a little bit about that. Some samplers, that can play different sounds at the same time, but we basically approach that from overlaying those sounds on top of each other, which is basically the same concept. So let's dig down a little farther. Next, let's take a look at some of the things they're talking about here. Let's kind of go through them and see which one of those might be kind of specific. I'm not trying to make sure that you're a complete, a sampler guru by the time I get done, but most of the basic topics that, like I've said in most of my videos, that we've at least tried to address them to where if we haven't specifically made you a sampler guru, that you have some direction to go get some very specific answers to applications you may be using it for. So on first review, I don't know that we need to do a historical overview. That would be kind of up to you if you want to do that. Sampler structure. Let's take a look at sampler structure. Alright, the sampler structure. We've addressed most of this also. Usually a sampler is controlled from an attached musical keyboard or other MIDI source. I do suggest you go back and watch the video series I did on MIDI to have a little bit better understanding how they're interacting. Each note message received by a sampler acts as a particular sample. Often multiple samples are arranged across the keyboard. Each assigned to a note or a group of notes. Keyboard tracking allows samples to be shifted in pitch by an appropriate amount each. That means basically when you put that sample on a different key, that it's going to automatically shift it. And we had talked about putting it on different notes, and it'll automatically shift the frequency to that sample to where it actually pitch shift it to a higher or lower frequency as you're, put it in a range. And assigned to a key zone, we had talked about that. That sample, that violin G2 sample, is going to be played on those three notes, and the violin B2 sample is going to be played on those three notes, so far and so forth, however many notes that sample can cover and still sound good. So we basically talked about that stuff. And there was looking at types, and the types that we had talked about, like the last sampler we looked at, and some of the other types, the basic sampler and the drum sampler. We didn't really get into hardware samplers, but basically you're dealing with some of the same things. But we've kind of addressed most of the types they're talking about there. Let's talk about specifications. Polyphony, how many voices can play simultaneously. We talked about that. Sample space, how much memory is available to load samples. We didn't really get into that, but basically, you know, that's a parameter you're going to look at any specific sampler. How much memory space is available? How many samples is it going to be able to hold when you start trying to do the things we talked about? So you're going to have to look into that for whatever specific sampler you're dealing with. Channels, how many different MIDI channels are available for different instruments? Now that we did not get into, but you need to go back and watch that series I did on MIDI and the channels of MIDI, and then you have a better understanding that, you know, if you're dealing with that type of things to where you're running different, you know, using a hardware sampler or software sampler, you're trying to run a bunch of different instruments on different MIDI channels, that was something we didn't get into. We were addressing it in the studio, but if you go back and watch that videos we did on MIDI and then come back to here and look at that and then start looking at how you're going to route that, because the routings inside your studio, once you understand that MIDI, that there'll be the same concepts inside of there dealing with your samplers from wherever you're sending it from, whether it's a standalone application or in your DAW or whatever, that, you know, between those two, then that'll make a little bit more sense. Because we didn't really approach that. We were just looking at the basic functions of it, but we couldn't address it anyway without going into that MIDI. So I suggest you go back and watch that. Bit depth, how much sample resolution can be supported. Bit depth, that's a very obvious thing when you're looking at any type of application that you want to check out what kind of bit depth it has anyway. How many discrete audio outputs are available. That's a simple parameter, and we addressed that a little bit with the drum sampler, and that was the basic concept of it. The routing of it is going to, you know, you're going to have to really look at what kind of application you're looking to do when you're dealing with either a hardware or software sampler. You know what, and if you go back and watch that video I did on MIDI, that'll make a lot more sense, because you might have just a real simple application, or if you got this huge application you want to do, that, you know, after you get done watching that video, that, you know, there's some things that you're going to have to look into, that as far as what your sequencers and your samplers can do. But I suggest you go watch that other video, and it'll probably open that door up to where any of that stuff that you may have issues with it, it'll probably address those issues specifically. I also want to back up a little bit. Discrete audio outputs. That's doing discrete audio. If you went back and watched that video on discrete signals, that, you know, there's a difference between the audio output, a MIDI output, and a discrete audio output. A discrete audio output is basically a digital signal that's put out. So it's not an actual, you know, normal, you know, analog signal. So that there, you need to go back and watch those videos so that you can relate it to it, you know, whatever system you're putting together, because in the DAW, you can route that discrete signal all over the dang place. In the hardware, if it's got normal analog signal out, a discrete signal out, and a MIDI signal out, and how many of them, then that's something you're going to want to address specifically to whatever instrument you're dealing with and the application that you're going to be trying to use that for. Storage is one thing we didn't talk about, but you're going to kind of have to address that, whether you're dealing what kind of application you're dealing with it. You know, if you're going to be moving it around a lot, taking it with you, or it's going to be in your DAW, what kind of drive you're saving to, or external flash drive or external hard drive. We're not going to get into that. All right, I think we covered most of these subjects. On here, if you get on Wikipedia, there's a bunch of different manufacturers that you can go take a look at, and I really do suggest you get on there and go find some of the ones that, you know, some of the better ones, you know, and just kind of work your way down the field, you know. Go find some of the ones that, you know, I mean, I know I can't afford that one, but, you know, I'm going to look at it and check some of them out, you know. Get on here and go find some of them, you know, and go take a look at them. You know, get on their site and take a look, you know, at some of the things they're able to do. And it might address some situations that might be questionable, or give you better direction that, you know, you might decide something, you might see something else that we didn't talk about that was like, whoa, dude, that's something that I'd really like to do. You know, something like that. I mean, that happens a lot, especially when you're dealing with synthesizers and samplers and things like that, that you run across something that's doing something, you know, and you're like, whoa, dude, that's floating my boat. And off you go, dude. You know, so I know that sounds funny, but, you know, I've run into that a lot, you know, and until I really understood what the heck I needed it for, that I'd be downloading stuff all the dang time. You know, I had a blast playing with synthesizers and samplers. Can be a lot of fun, you know, and just doing cool stuff until I really figured out exactly what, you know, its purpose was. And some of them I still download just to have fun. You know, I'll get in there and I'll get some new sampler or some synth or something that does some cool thing and you know, want to experiment and play with it, you know, and it's just something cool to have fun. But there's a kind of a difference in some, you know, that it's for something that you're doing or it's just to have fun and experiment around on and whatever. And sometimes, a lot of times those come together to some point. So I suggest you look around at those. So I think we basically covered it. We went through this thing on Wikipedia, you know, after we got done with all that. And most of these subjects we've covered. I do recommend you go through the synthesizer section, you know, site on Wikipedia and the sampler site, and read through them and see some other things that if you think something was, you know, it'll help clarify anything else that was going on. And you know, there's lots of links to go out on to get some more in-depth information on anything that we might have covered, you know, that may not be clear to you at this point. So I hope you enjoyed this short 3-thing series on samplers, video series, and we're going to get on to synthesizers next. So hopefully at this point right now that you've got a pretty good understanding of samplers, you know, and any questions that you might have, that you more than likely have some direction to go get some answers very specific to your needs, or your production, or what you might think you might be wanting to do with them. So I hope you enjoyed that. Peace, hope, love. See you in the next video.